How's it going, Eric? It's great to have you on the show. I know Wave Neuro has been a front runner with helping veterans, especially the special operations veterans, with a variety of mental health treatments ranging from TBIs, uh, depression, anxiety, focus issues. At what point were you aware of this technology? Did you develop it, or were you just aware of it? Like we need to turn this into something that can really help the veteran community.
Yeah, it was a great question. Well, really honored to be here with both of you. This was really sort of a long time in the works where when I first was encountered the technology, I was actually at the Boeing company as their chief physician. And I was hearing about this through some friends who were going through the program. And just by way of background, I was a Navy flight surgeon more than 20 years ago, deployed with the Marines. And so I had a lot of buddies who were struggling with traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress and a variety of other conditions. And I had one pilot and one crew chief in particular who were very passionate about how this really changed their lives. So I started paying attention to it and was able to meet a lot of the people, the scientists and the engineers who were involved, and joined the company about 8 years ago. And it's really been a full sprint ever since. And like you guys, it's hard to have served and to not really be fired up about helping this community when we find something that can help in a meaningful way. And so I ended up sending in about a dozen of my closest friends just to kind of beta test it and see if this was real. And each of them, the changes were not subtle. These were fairly profound changes where it wasn't just the veteran, it was their spouses and their children who were coming in saying, you gave my husband back. It's the man I married 10 years ago. Their kids weren't afraid of them anymore. And it touches all the, good reasons we go into medicine is to try to
Hmm.
help people. And these were conditions that we thought there weren't really great therapies out there that could help. And so for all those reasons, the mission and the purpose of really getting this out there, I joined the company about 8 years ago. And one of the first things I did was reached out to some of my friends and colleagues from service, one of whom was the command surgeon of Special Operations Command. And he, of course, like many of us, was skeptical when he first heard about it, but he said, I'm going to send in 5 of my worst cases. If you help one of them, we're going to do a trial together. And we're very fortunate. 5 out of 5 of those people benefited from the treatment. We did launch an FDA trial that's still in the works. But I think what made this a little bit different, for me at least, was this was about mission and purpose, right? Like to be able to help people, not just, hundreds, but we're talking about millions of people who are struggling with traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. It was really worth this investment in terms of shifting careers, taking on a certain amount of risk, and getting back in the trenches and really doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
Um, so,
So
so yeah,
walk me through real quick. What exactly is the treatment that you guys are offering? How does it work?
yeah, it's called magnetic EEG-guided resonance therapy. And in a nutshell, there's 3 steps. The first step is to get what's called an electroencephalogram. Much in the same way, an electrocardiogram is an electrophysiologic picture of the heart. We get these electrophysiologic pictures of the brain. And step 2 is we run those through computational neuroanalytics, and we're looking for disruptions in brain activity. And if Kevin, I think if you've been through it, it's pretty
Hmm.
clear. You can see that these large networks can be disrupted. And specifically, there's a circuit we call the default mode network that's been very closely correlated to traumatic brain injury, concussion, and even post-traumatic stress. And then the third step is an actual FDA-approved treatment called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we can geo-navigate to any area of the brain we see disruption, and we can provide gentle but effective stimulation to these areas to try to restore these networks and to bring people back to their optimal function. And you touched on something earlier that was interesting. A lot of my friends were saying, we love what you're doing for the men and women who are hurt. We actually view this as a performance technology because a lot of the people who are coming back, they're reporting better marksmanship scores, they're feeling better, they're sleeping better. That's for this community, that means a lot more.
Well,
And
you
so,
guys actually started off as more of a um, performance based, like working with professional athletes and stuff to improve cognitive capabilities. And this was almost uh, an offshoot of what you guys realized the potential is working with TBIs and stuff, correct?
That's right. That's right. So there's obviously, if you can help people think more clearly, and what we've learned since those early days is we see improvements in reaction time. That's going to be of great interest to elite athletes. We now see a lot of C-suite executives. Anyone who's interested in performance is interested in the technology, and that was a paradigm shift in our approach. Is we're now not just confined to clinical medical intervention. We see a lot of people, Formula race car drivers, U.S. Olympians, and these athletes who are interested in some amount of performance benefit. That can be controversial in some people's eyes,
Mm-hmm.
but the truth is many of those folks are suffering from some degree of traumatic brain injury or concussion. And just as an example, if you went to our San Diego clinic, a lot of big wave surfers come in, and we don't always think about the barotrauma from a 30-foot wave crashing on somebody. But we can pretty clearly see on the EEGs that there's been some disruption in neural activity, and that's what we strive to restore. Um,
Yeah, saw you guys have treated people like Shane Dorian, and some other surfers. And there's a huge application across the spectrum of performance athletes, and the military is starting to recognize special operations as performance athletes in some regard. What we're doing is very different, but just having that high intensity, high focus, high drive, high output mentality with the people, where you're also trying to maintain the longevity of these people, because it costs a ton of money. It takes a huge amount of time to train them up, and so being able to not only improve them cognitively, but also turn back the clock on some of the strain and the abuse that we've done to their bodies to keep them in that peak condition longer. It's got huge effects. And ironically, or not ironically, but interestingly enough, I didn't find out about your guys' program through the military. I found out about you guys through my jujitsu gym. You guys set up a free consultation with all the people from the gym. Anybody who wanted to come by can get the EEG. And then when I went in, I found out about the stuff you guys had with Wounded Warrior Project and with Special Operations Command, and started just having a conversation with Stacy at the time. And it was really cool to see all the different people that you guys are working with, not just special operations veterans, but veterans across all walks of life, and supporting their continued service, and also as they're getting out, helping people realign their focus and uh, work through depression and stuff like that. So obviously this has been a multifaceted approach of what you guys are able to support.
Yeah, it's an interesting time in the sense that what you bring up in terms of longevity, there's a saying that you don't have to be sick or broken to want to be well. And we may be doing a disservice to the community if we wait until somebody raises their hand and says, I really need help.
Mm-hmm.
And to have this tool now where we can see in the EEG if people are starting to degrade, but not fall off a cliff, or we can get ahead of it and hopefully give them some help and some benefit before they really start to struggle. So yeah, I think just the EEG as a longitudinal biomarker that we can track over time is important. But especially for people who are looking for some kind of performance benefit. And in particular, one of the things we see a lot is improvement in sleep quality.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you're an elite operator or an elite athlete or an average Joe walking down the street, sleep disruption and circadian rhythm disruption is incredibly prevalent these days. And you think about you're both in special operations, you think about that environment where you're going 18 time zones away, you're operating at night because of the tactical advantage of having night vision, and then you're coming back home and expected to readapt very quickly. Your biology doesn't work that fast. It's a really
Mm-hmm.
hard thing to do. And I suspect a lot of people, they never completely habituate to the home environment again. It sometimes takes months or years.
Are you
You
familiar
talk,
with Kirk Parsley?
Oh yeah, yeah, down in Texas, the sleep doc.
Yeah, the SEAL who got into medical space did a bunch of research on sleep. I don't remember which way it happened. If it was he started at sleep and figured out about the hormone issues, or if he was looking at hormone issues and discovered the sleep. But basically, they're completely intertwined. Where they're trying to figure out why SEALs and other special operators, who you'd think would be at the top peak of testosterone in terms of how their physiology works, and what they're finding is the vast majority of SEALs were in the bottom 50th percentile, and he was just like, "What is going on here?" And they were seeing that because they're going on these deployments, where oftentimes they're working at night and they're trying to get sleep in where they can. The sleep's already disrupted; they're not getting a lot of sleep, and then they're uh, supplementing sleep with Ambien and other sleep medication, where Ambien really doesn't give you sleep; it's more of like blacking out from drinking too much. What they're seeing is the lack of sleep was causing the lack of REM cycles, which is where I think it was REM, where you produce testosterone, and then the lack of testosterone actually affects your sleep. And so there's just this downward death spiral of lack of sleep, lack of testosterone, lack of testosterone, lack of sleep, and it was just crushing the community. So we started doing a ton of research into the figuring that stuff out. And so I was thinking that getting this EEG on your brain is very similar to getting that hormone baseline, so you know where you were at one point, and then you can try and bring it back there later.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been a really fascinating sort of development in terms of the evidence base. Is there's a lot more understanding and knowledge of how sleep is integrated into neuroendocrine disruption and long-term health in many, many ways. But one of the biological mechanisms that was more recently illuminated was this concept of the glymphatic system, which you have to forgive me if this I go down a little bit of a bunny trail, but I think it'll be
Please.
relevant. So there are these structures within your brain that were previously thought to be just structural scaffolding, these astroglial cells. But there's a lady out of University of Rochester named Macon Nettergaard. She used a technology called two-photon microscopy, where you could in real time visualize brain tissue during sleep. And what she found was in the deepest stages of sleep, REM sleep in stage 3, stage 4 sleep, these cells shrink pretty significantly, and cerebral spinal fluid rushes through the brain and it washes away the oxidative stress and metabolites accumulated throughout the day. And there's a separate study that was done out of Washington University in St. Louis where they lumbar punctured people after just one night of sleep deprivation. And what they found was a dramatic increase in the concentration of beta amyloid and tau protein. And if those sound familiar, those are sort of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And so you think, okay, so if just one night of sleep deprivation is causing an increase in these kind of proteins, what happens when people are sleep deprived for years?
So you're saying Hell Week is bad for the health?
Yeah, yeah. And when you're young and you have a lot of neuroplasticity, you can definitely recover from those kind of things. But sleep should definitely be in the forefront of everyone's mind in terms of longevity and maintaining good health. But it's perhaps not surprising that with years of chronic sleep deprivation, our memory starts to decline just a bit. And then, touching on the testosterone piece, yeah, these are intimately interlinked. And it's hard to tease out. It's pretty well known that with severe concussion and even these overpressurization blast injuries, it doesn't have to be the mechanical TBI that people get on a football field or in car accidents, but these blast injuries can lead to neuroendocrine disruption where you see some low testosterone too. But you compound that with sleep deprivation and all these other environmental factors, and it's perhaps not surprising to see even the elite communities in the military seeing their testosterone levels drop.
Yeah.
What's the downstream effects of? I mean, so I understand. Like, so if you had those elevated proteins during just one night of bad sleep, like, is there a way to track what that's doing over the long term with objective data?
Yeah, so we don't have great tools to do that over time. At least tools that are non-invasive, like doing a lumbar puncture on somebody is incredibly invasive.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that study would even pass an ethical board again, these days, it's hard to speak to find people intentionally. But to be clear, those just the presence of proteins by itself doesn't mean you're doomed. The proteins there's a process called phosphorylation where they develop into hard tangles inside the brain. And that is what is thought to lead to some of these signs of dementia. And most people, if you get a good night of sleep, or if you're taking care of yourself, doing good exercise and nutrition, you're not going to have that level of phosphorylation. But we're now starting to better understand how sleep may be tied to some of these processes of aging and cognitive decline. But for your question, yeah, we don't have great tools or instruments right now to track that over time with any kind of fidelity.
And is there anything other than sleep? I'm sure that there's things other than sleep that would prevent phosphorylation. Is sleep, obviously sleep being one of the major contributors, but is there anything else that would help, I guess, remove that process?
Sleep is thought to be really the fundamental mechanism with which biologically we've been sort of engineered to clear the system. But I think that there's some early evidence and promise that certain supplements, certainly exercise, there's a natural sort of increase in the amount of blood flow and the amount of oxygen exchange that's happening just through the increased, blood circulation and blood flow through the brain. And then yes, nutrition certainly is going to be important. The type of fuel you put in your body is going to matter in terms of your long-term health. And these are, I think, most of the community will understand, these are sort of the building blocks that are foundational to health is exercise/movement, nutrition/diet, and then recovery and sleep. And I would say all of them, there's sometimes these academic debates about what's the most important. And really, they're all very important. There's sort of a fourth category that's starting to emerge, which is some people
Ice
call
baths?
Ice
ice
baths.
baths are definitely good. Definitely good.
Solves all problems.
It falls into recovery. But spiritual connection is thought to be pretty important too. We can just categorize that as mental health. But there's new emerging data, what they call social determinants, as being really important for long-term health as well. But that's harder to measure, as you can imagine.
And so with the treatment you guys offer, I know it starts off with, you get that 10-minute EEG. It gives you a map of your brain activity, essentially, where the different brain waves are, or what the brain waves are in the different regions. And at least when I went through about 2 years ago, they map the front, the middle, and the back, and they want to essentially the goal is to create a protocol that'll get all three regions in sync with one another. The way I had it described is if the front of the brain is at a higher frequency than the back of the brain, and the thought process moves from the back to the front, then it'll be like having a conversation with somebody that is just speaking really slow, and you're trying to have them get to the point, and you almost get that anxious feeling of, please speak faster and get to what you're talking about. Or the other end, which is if the back of the brain is moving too quickly relative to the front, then it's just trying to cram a whole bunch of information into into an area that hasn't processed it yet, and you feel overwhelmed. How do you guys build this protocol to get everything back in sync, and what ultimately is the outcome of getting all the regions talking with one another on the same frequency?
Sure, that's actually, you described it really well. And so
Stacy described it well to me.
Yeah, Stacy's wonderful. Yeah, she's very knowledgeable on what we do. But really, what we're trying to do, we call that what's being described as synchrony. We call that alpha coherence. And there's a specific cadence and rhythm everyone's brain uniquely has that we try to measure. We call that the alpha frequency, generally between 8 and 13 hertz, which means your brain is encoding information 8 to 13 times per second. The population average is going to be somewhere around 10. What's interesting is within the soft community, we usually see people who are a little bit faster. And that sort of confers certain advantages in terms of reaction times, processing speed.
Do you also see that with high-end athletes and stuff?
Yeah, depending on position. And so it's interesting. A lot of the wide receivers, cornerbacks, and quarterbacks, what they call skill positions, tend to be really fast. And then many of the behemoth defensive linemen offensive linemen. They can be middle range. Sometimes you even see slower. And it's not a reflection of IQ, or like there's advantages and pros and cons to all these different profiles. I always try to say there's no perfect brain, but there are certain professions and strengths and weaknesses with each of these types of profiles. But just to sort of provide a couple of illustrations of what you were talking about earlier, where when the back and the front may not be completely in tune with each other. If you are an 11.3 hertz brain, but we see an area in the front that is cycling, let's just say it's 6 hertz, that information mismatch may cause you to feel some depression, because prefrontal cortex is executive function, emotional regulation, impulse control. And so we've all sort of seen, our friends and buddies who may struggle with these things after an injury. And it sort of starts to make sense when you understand kind of the geospatial injuries that are occurring and the deficits that might occur based on that type of injury. And there's a converse scenario where, let's just say, an area of the brain in sort of the right back of the brain, the visual cortex, is cycling too fast. Let's just say at 30 hertz. And somebody may be scanning their environment nonstop 30 times per second, but if the rest of the brain only processes it 10, 11 times per second, there's this information overload that may manifest as anxiety. So really what we're trying to do is just look for the disruption. And a lot of people will tell us their healing journey started once they could see it, because many times they've been told by very well-intentioned, doctors or medical staff that, your MRI looks good, your CT looks good. The difference being those are anatomical images. They're really good at detecting a brain bleed or a tumor or something along those lines. EEG is a functional image. It's something that's taken over a time domain, kind of like a video. And when you take that step of looking at things dynamically over time, you can see how the different areas of the brain are communicating with each other. And if you see a deficit, it becomes really easy to point to it and say, let's fix that. And it's been interesting to see, not only is the treatment helpful, but a lot of patients become motivated that, okay, I'm really going to focus on my sleep now, or I'm really going to eat right. I'm going to go back to my exercise regimen, because previously they may have lost hope, right? Like, I've tried these things, nothing's working. And so that sort of global approach to improving somebody's overall wellness and health, I think that's part of the formula that works.
That aligns really well with the veteran community. You give us a target or goal to focus on. You're like, all right, here's the problem. We can start working on this thing. And they're like, oh, I can do that. But when they're told, we don't know what it is, this is just how you are, this is what it is, without giving directions, it creates a lot of anxiety or uncertainty about what's going on. As soon as you give people a target to work on, and you can say, here's the problem, this is what we think it is, let's start working on this. And then coming back, was like 10 weeks later, you're doing the scan again, and now you can see the change of the progress. This is the treatment, this is what the treatment's been doing. We've also told you to get better sleep, get blue light in the morning, all these other things, and now you can see, hopefully, the improvement over time.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful. These unifying principles are starting to emerge. And, as effective and powerful as a treatment is, in isolation, there's a lot of other things that need to go into this for somebody to be successful over the long term. And many times, not everyone, but many times, somebody may need a certain amount of marriage counseling, or they may need to go through some form of talk therapy. They may have other types of, injuries that need to get fixed, whether it's orthopedic or, neurologic. But I think the distinction is it's giving people a chance, sort of this hard reboot of, okay, I can think more clearly now. How do I want to approach this strategically, where I can set myself up for success for the rest of my life? And I think that's a real gift. Not everyone's going to succeed right out of the gate, but the other benefit, I think, is in the back of their mind, there's an understanding, well, I can go back. If something happens, because life happens, whether, we get a divorce or something happens to one of our loved ones, if you're going through a hard time, there is something that can help. And I think just that knowledge is really helpful and meaningful.
I think that's the case with a lot of these newer treatments that are coming available. We think about, psychedelic assisted therapy, and one question I'll after I make this point, but I think that it's such a good stepping stone into a better tomorrow, just being able to like see that hope for the first time, maybe in a long time, and start developing a program around you that's going to be holistically treat you as a person. Now my question was, how does what you guys doing differ from neurofeedback? That's I know that TMS is much different, but is the first part of this, how does that differ from neurofeedback?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's some nuance in the sense that for those who may be unfamiliar among your listeners, neurofeedback, you are wearing an EEG, and typically you're doing some kind of mental exercise based on a computer-based game to move a ball up or down, something along those lines, and you're trying to engage certain areas of the brain and train them to become more active. And there's pretty good data that this can help for a number of different conditions. And so, I'm an advocate for neurofeedback, where TMS and EEG-guided TMS, or what we call MERT, is different, is whereas neurofeedback is using your own cognition and some gamification of brain exercise to try to improve brain function. TMS is actually an external stimulus that's using first order principles of physics to move neurons in the right direction. And so, it tends to be a bit more powerful in terms of the clinical effect size, like how much benefit people are getting. We're seeing stronger data on the TMS and MERT side than neurofeedback. But for some people, they may prefer, the neurofeedback because it doesn't require sort of an external intervention the same way TMS does. But we've had great experience with TMS, and in particular, the safety profile is quite good. Nothing's 100% safe. We always try to be very transparent and clear. We don't want to misrepresent anything. There are certain risks. The most common risk is a transient headache. That's usually alleviated by over-the-counter ibuprofen or Tylenol. And the most significant risk that we talk about is a risk of seizure. Knocking on wood, we've actually never had one at one of our centers. It's more of a hypothetical risk. The numbers that we've seen are anywhere from 1 in 10 million to 1 in 100,000, depending on what study you look at. And to give you a benchmark, these Nintendo Switches and Nintendo Game Boys our kids play with, the flickering of the screen, those brochures list a risk of seizure of 1 in 4,000. So the numbers are pretty safe, but we still need to be complete transparent about it. And so every patient will sign an informed consent, and the doctor or nurse will walk through them with all of that. But yeah, that is one of the risks associated with the treatment.
And you guys
has there ever been any?
Oh, go on.
Once has there ever been any studies with neurofeedback being used with MERT?
Not to date. I would love to do that. So you're touching on, I think, an important point, and I think the overarching theme would be there's never been a greater time for hope and optimism for the future, because there is so much coming in the pipeline in terms of combined modalities and what some people are calling stack therapies, stack protocols. And neurofeedback plus MERT would be one modality. We've had some conversations, could we do meditation and some breathing mindfulness exercises in conjunction with MERT? But we're currently in the midst of a trial. It's sponsored by a wonderful nonprofit organization called Special Operations Care Fund. Tomahawk Charitable Solutions has also been a contributor, but they're calling it the Trifecta Study. And it's a 3-stage study where, and I think this is just for special operations veterans, but they get a kind of full head-to-toe evaluation to see if they're candidates for hormone replacement therapy. As both of you know, neuroendocrine disruption is very common in the community, very closely correlated to traumatic brain injuries and concussions. The second stage is getting psychedelic therapy. They go down to Mexico. This is all approved through IRB, an institutional review board that manages the human ethics for these studies. But they go down. It's a very high-end, rigorously controlled setting, but they get ibogaine therapy and 5-MeO-DMT. And then they come up to California to get these MERT sessions. And so it's one of the first sort of combination therapy trials that we've done. And the feedback that we're getting early, and we're still blinded to the data, I can't share with you hard numbers yet, but anecdotally, a lot of the subjects who are going through have told us this is not 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. This is 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. Like, this is really kind of a dramatic shift in terms of how many of these people are feeling. So,
are you guys still taking applicants for this study?
I believe they are. And so, and I should, maybe we can link that in the show notes. I can send you a link. Yeah. But if you go to the SOCF website.
SOCF? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, certainly, we've been blessed to be able to be a part of that. I believe Marcus Capone's group, who you may know, Kevin, they're called VETS. I believe that they're the other affiliate for the study in terms of the psychedelic therapy. And so it's interesting how much, the public sentiment and community has shifted on psychedelics, whereas I think as recently as 10 years ago, it may have been a little too forward-leaning for a lot of people. But these days, I think people are very open-minded to it, which I think is a good direction, because they're definitely beneficial. We've been pretty convinced with the therapeutic benefit just from the sense of we see the change in the EEG, not just from ibogaine, but we've had people go to ayahuasca ceremonies overseas and come back, and we get pre and post ceremony EEGs, and we can pretty clearly see there's a positive change. And so, and the
Have you
idea,
guys done long-term revisits, immediately before, immediately after, and then 6 months, a year later?
So we're not yet at the long-term range. I think that's coming. And that is one of the questions. That's an open question with some of the psychedelic modalities. How durable is the benefit? And that's where we think sort of combining these modalities may really shine, is we may see a greater durability of benefit. But the concept that's really being engaged is these compounds, whether it's ayahuasca or psilocybin or ibogaine, they are engaging a certain amount of neuroplasticity in the brain where it becomes open to new input. And then if you're on top of that providing a treatment that's reinforcing alpha, like the dominant frequency or cadence of the brain, could we see a more lasting benefit? And we don't know the answers yet, but I think over the next decade, a lot of these questions are going to start becoming answered. And that's why I do think genuinely it's an exciting time to be tracking this and to be in the industry, because I think we're just at the beginning of the mountain to climb on better understanding brain science. It's to this point been a bit mystifying, and I think we're starting to better understand it.
So when I went through, you guys had two different treatment options. My wife went through and she had the helmet that was lower intensity, longer duration, more continuous duration of the stimulation, or my treatment through, I don't remember if I did the Wounded Warrior or the SOCF version, but it was the hockey puck looking thing placed on the forehead, or it was like two hockey pucks put on the forehead, and then it was almost like an intense tapping on the forehead. And then you guys also did front and back versions of that. Are you guys still doing both options, or have you guys seen better results with one over the other, or is it really case dependent on the individual?
Yeah, it's really based on the individual. And so that portable unit that you talked about, it was researched under the moniker STMS, synchronized transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we developed a sort of wellness version of it that we call the Sonal, the 5 letters in the middle, personalization. And the energy being delivered is substantially smaller than the version you got. But it's sufficient to trigger what's called an evoked potential. in a neuron and hopefully impart some clinical benefit to patients. And so that was most rigorously researched for depression. The VA did a study on PTSD where we saw a positive signal. And they most recently just completed recruitment for a substance use disorder study. And we're waiting on the results from that. But that is, I think, one of the interesting epiphenomena that we see with this treatment is we've heard pretty consistently people say, some of the compulsion that I had to take either opioid pain medication or to drink, sometimes that gets mitigated a bit by the treatment. And so there are some addiction centers that are really exploring this, and the results, the early results so far have been pretty exciting, that this could be an adjunct to kind of substance use detoxification and give people a better chance at staying sober for a longer period of time.
What about gambling addiction?
That's a good question. So gambling is, there's a nice study out of Stanford where they started studying what are called para-addictions, which are addictions to behaviors, not substances. And so I think we're all used to the substance use addictions like alcohol and opioids and cocaine and methamphetamine, but there's addictions to behaviors too, whether it's gambling or eating or sex. And what's interesting is it is the same area of the brain that's responsible, an area called the anterior cingulate cortex. Functionally, this is the reward center of the brain. And anytime something good happens, whether you win the lottery or your team wins the Super Bowl or you fall in love, this area of the brain lights up, and there's a big reservoir of dopamine that sits underneath it called the ventral tegmental area that'll squeeze, and you have a big surge of dopamine in it, and you have a feeling of euphoria. And many addictionologists believe the external stimulus doesn't matter. You're actually just chasing that euphoria, the dopamine surge. And you can get that through a substance, you can get it through a behavior, and it's very hard to rewire that once it's triggered. And so there are some nice studies looking at long-acting opioids like fentanyl, where the brain tends to rewire. The researchers sometimes will say permanently, but the longest data that I've seen is a year out from a methadone treatment. This area of the brain is still overactive. And so we have seen a number of cases where, with the EEG, we can see this area of the brain seems to settle down just a little bit. But yeah, I think that's an area for exploration in the future. I don't have any data right now on gambling, but it's fascinating that you brought that up because it is an area that is currently being researched. Could some of these interventions help for gambling?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And that's an interesting concept that it is almost agnostic to the stimulant, because how does because how is family dynamics, because you always hear about if you have an alcoholic parent, you're probably more susceptible to alcohol. Is that an environment thing? Has there been any studies on that, whether it's like a gene or environment thing?
Yeah, there are fierce academic debates on the contributions of genetic profile versus social and behavioral environment. I think the quick answer is we're still learning. There's something called SNPs, these single nucleotide polymorphisms, where people can be predisposed to a certain type of behavior. And the social environment would be what sort of sets it off, so to speak. And the most elegant example of that, there are twin studies where sometimes these twins get separated, and one may grow up in a very nurturing household and one may grow up in a not so nurturing household, and how they do both in school and their success in life in terms of career and education can vary quite dramatically based on their social environment, even with the same DNA and genetic code. So there's definitely a social environmental component to it. If there's a sense of, well, my genetics is my genetic, and my dad was an alcoholic, so I'm going to be an alcoholic too. That's actually not true. People do have free will and they can control their environment to some degree, but they may be predisposed, and some may say they're vulnerable to it. But yeah, it's I would say at this point it's an open question, and we're still kind of exploring the evidence.
And you guys also have treatment protocol for children with autism, correct?
That's correct. It's interesting. And so in the very beginning, I talked a little bit about default mode network. And that is specifically, we see a lot of disruption in the DMN and the prefrontal cortex. And in large population size epidemiologic studies, these are not our studies. These are studies done by, Yale and the National Center for PTSD, where they're trying to get large sample sizes of 500 to 1,000 plus subjects. And it's pretty clear with PTSD and TBI, they've got these large population size studies where they can show whether it's fMRI or EEG data, there's disruption in the DMN. We see that in autism too. And I couldn't make that connection for the longest time. I was like, how can we help these adult veterans, but it's helping these autistic children too? And it wasn't until I made this connection that there's disruption in the default mode network in both of those communities, where it sort of made sense. Okay, this is why we're seeing that change. The difference being in most of the veterans that we see, they entered the discussion with a very healthy brain, and through an environmental exposure or repeated trauma or chronic sleep deprivation, we see changes in the network. Whereas with autistic children, they're sort of born with that slow or actually absent development of alpha activity in the front of the brain. And that's something we see pretty consistently. So we can actually start to activate some of those neurons. And it just takes a few of them to wake up and start working to see some pretty meaningful changes in the behavior of these children. And there's a group in Australia who's doing some good research on this out of the University of Sunshine Coast. I think it's called the Thompson Institute of Neuroscience, where they're measuring these things and trying to get into granular detail about what types of dimensions are changing social behaviorally. And it appears that verbally they're able to, their vocabulary increases a bit. There is some social change in the sense that they can interact more, and things that other families or parents may not perceive as being really significant can matter a lot to a parent. And just talking to some of the parents who have come through, I had one who's a professor at a fairly prestigious university say, I would have done anything to have gotten a full night of sleep because my child never slept through the night until this treatment. And so you think about the second order impact that's having on the parent. But the other thing a couple of parents have told me is I can go to a restaurant and they don't have a meltdown if they don't have chicken nuggets. Like it may sound small, but I really empathize. Like I've got 5 kids, and I know just even with like, it's not always easy, right? And so if children have that cognitive flexibility to eat a different food or to be able to socialize with other kids, that changes a lot for a parent and a family. And this is rewinding way back, but when I first got involved, one of my neighbors, part of the reason I decided to join was I got to watch his kid develop over about 2 years. And he went from being completely nonverbal, he was around 7 years old and wasn't potty trained. And within a month of doing the treatment, he became potty trained. He was able to articulate his words better. And wow, you just think about what that could mean for these communities. And so we do owe the scientific and academic community an academically rigorous double-blind randomized controlled trial on that. It's very expensive. These studies are very expensive to do. So we're applying for grants and looking for resources to do that study. But yeah, so you may have, in your time there, you may have seen autistic children kind of coming in and coming out. And that's another use case and application for the treatment that we're exploring. That's been pretty exciting to see.
That's amazing.
What's the diagnosis timeline look like for autism? When do most children get diagnosed? And like the reason I ask that is because I think like, is there a way, or I'm sure that you're probably thinking about this, is like how do you potentially intervene earlier, so that maybe the recruitment of those alpha waves could, I don't know, could potentially recruit others and make it less, I don't know, mitigate some of the behaviors.
It's interesting. It's a controversial topic in the sense of there's not a universal consensus on a type of scale or instrument to use that all doctors would agree with. And that was part of we actually did a pretty deep dive into designing a study. And it sort of fell apart when we got different doctors from different universities together, because there's a lot of argument about whether we should use, there's an instrument called the CAR score. It's a clinician administered autism rating scale. There's an ADOS, there's an SRS, and we couldn't find consensus on a way that would be convincing to the community that we can help with autism. And the diagnosis of it is similarly controversial. In terms of alpha being a tool for that, the tricky part is alpha doesn't really emerge until 4, 5, 6 years old. And many of these children are being diagnosed at 2, 3. And so there are some centers, like we leave it up to, the doctors who are using the technology to make that risk assessment and to make a decision, because typically TMS is more of a tool for adults, but given the need in that community, the youngest age people are being treated varies a bit. But in terms of when they can be first diagnosed, generally people start picking up on there's something wrong and my child is delayed between 18 months to 3 or 4 years. Sometimes much later, that point where the child may start falling behind can vary quite a bit. But typically the diagnosis will be, 3, 4 years or younger.
And what type of treatment are you typically doing? Which version is the helmet, or is it the higher intensity puck stimulation?
Yeah, it's a higher intensity stimulation, but they actually lower the intensity quite a bit for children.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting. Like most of the industry for adults, they're doing what's called super threshold treatment, meaning you may recall the first day they may have done single pulses on your head to try to evoke one of your fingers to twitch. They call that a motor threshold. And whatever your 100% motor threshold is, most of the industry cranks it up to 120% motor threshold, thinking more is better. Our protocol is actually sub-threshold, with the philosophy that precision matters more than power. And so we typically go to 80% motor threshold, sometimes 60% motor threshold. But for children, many times there's some anxiety sitting in the chair. So we lower it to 40, sometimes 30% motor threshold, where it's just a very light tapping. And it's interesting, usually by the second, third, or fourth treatment, they're holding it to their head because they like the sensation. And that's been really intriguing to me, because I thought coming in, wow, I mean, it requires the patience of an angel to be able to, sit and chase a child around. But they actually, even the really young kids will sit still and receive the treatment. And it's very common to see them running into the clinic because they enjoy being there. So it wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but it's encouraging to see that type of change in behavior.
And how long is the treatment typically lasting over, like days, weeks, months? And is there usually an endpoint? So after 3 months of treatment, they're pretty solid for the long term, maybe a couple of maintenance things, or is it continual treatment for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see that. And in the sense with the autism community, the benefit tends to be very durable. And even in the periods where there's a gap, so we've been very fortunate in the sense of we have a lot of repeat customers that will come in during the summer. They don't want the kids to sort of miss out on school. And so they'll come in for whatever period they can come during the summer at one of our centers. And in that 8, 9 month gap, we frequently see good development in brain function. And so there is this overarching paradigm that whether you believe in God or we just call it Mother Nature, we've been engineered to be healing organisms. I believe in God. And so, I think we've just been blessed with the ability to heal. Sometimes we just need a nudge in the right direction, right? And so if you put 2 ends of a broken bone together, it'll heal, sometimes grow back stronger. If you put 2 ends of a wound marching together with stitches or dermabond, that will heal as well. And the brain sometimes just needs a gentle nudge in the right direction. And once you give it that stimulus, the body does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And that was one of the most powerful case illustrations to me. Was I mentioned my neighbor's kid, and after the first summer he left, that period was one of his most accelerated periods of growth. And he was Scout of the Year at his Boy Scout troop. He was able to start spelling and do math. And I remember his tutors, because he was in California, we have something called an IEP programs, is for kind of extra teaching. And his tutors and teachers were saying, whatever he did, like, just keep doing it because he's really catching things now. And but he wasn't getting treatment at the time, right? I think that was number one, a very dedicated and loving family, and then two, some really good teachers around him. But he's able to absorb it in a slightly different way now. And I would say it's a similar experience in the veteran community, presuming that people are taking care of themselves, right?
Mhm.
So the treatment's not going to overcome if they leave our center and start doing like all night benders for a week, drinking until they fall asleep, lines of Coke, like this isn't going to, their brain's not going to be healthy. But if they take care of themselves, where, they're doing, a good exercise regimen, clean diet, and, going to sleep, and, to the degree possible, at the right time, and, good hygiene, we see, I mean, we're out, 6, 7, 8 years from a lot of the first patients that we're seeing. And our first clinical trial of 80 veterans, knocking on wood, we still keep in touch with most of those people. We've not had anybody expire, and about 20 of those entered the trial suicidal.
Wow.
So we're encouraged with that long-term data. But like I said before, you always have to sort of keep tabs, and, we always do buddy checks with other friends, that you never know when something might go sideways, or, life intervenes. And so, yeah, the long-term benefit, I think that there's good evidence emerging that people are doing well for longer than just the period of treatment. But I think a lot of that's still TBD in terms,
Mhm.
and a lot of it is really dependent on how the individual is taking care of themselves.
The environment's huge. They talk about that with any kind of addiction problems. You can't go to treatment no matter what whether it's medical or just social and mental training. If you're going right back into the same environment, you're not going to see any change. You need to adjust your lifestyle, and that's why they were talking so much about why you're going through this treatment. Really push to get 7.5, 8 hours of sleep every night. Get the blue light first thing in the morning. No sunglasses, no windows. Actually, be outside in the sunlight. Eat well, and through all these different areas, you should see improvement. So it's difficult to say, yeah, it's only because of the treatment that you're getting better, but obviously it is a significant nudge, as you said, to the brain. Hey, we can start getting healed now. We're going to employ these other treatment things, nutrition, activity, being in a healthy environment to give you the best possible chance. But by giving you that nudge, you can actually begin the healing process, as opposed to maybe at best in some cases stagnating, not getting worse.
Yeah, absolutely. There is one other concept that I should probably give a shout out to, our group in Ohio. There's so actually one of your team buddies, Kevin, his name is Frank Hoagland. He's a senator in Ohio. He passed a bill to give access to this treatment to every veteran and first responder. And that's in its fourth year running with great success. The data is kind of mind blowing in terms of they're seeing 60 to 70% reduction in symptoms of depression and PTSD, and TBI. And there's a couple of addiction metrics in there. Not everyone fills out that form because some people don't have addictions. But they're adding a new, or they're at least lobbying to get a new program implemented where they can give people skills too coming out of the program. So one of the biggest risk factors for poor mental health and even thoughts of self-harm is unemployment. And they want to give some of these people skills training so they can become plumbers, electricians, these trade schools where there's a shortage almost everywhere of people who have these types of skills. And I think that's been a missing piece to this point is, people leave our clinics and We hope that we are teaching them, here's what we need to sleep well. Here, surround yourself with kind of good influences and avoid toxic relationships type thing. But in terms of, 2 years, 3, 4 years down the road, giving them a vocation and a career calling, that's been a missing piece that I think is going to be fascinating to see how this unfolds over the next 5 to 10 years. Because I think that that type of program where you're providing 360-degree care to somebody, if we're truly invested in the long-term health and wellness of our patient populations, I think that's a critical piece to it.
I was just talking to one of my buddies who had gone through a rehab program about a year ago or so, and one of the things he's working on right now, or he's very passionate about, is the unemployment part. Is they go to rehab and then they go back to wherever they came from, and then they don't have a job, and that can cause a lot of struggle and people to relapse just because they're financially unstable. So yeah, that's really cool. I had no idea that was a thing in Ohio. So you talking about like some of the ancillary, the outside things, I guess outside of like MERT and some of these other treatments, but we talked about supplements earlier. What supplements are you like? You got to be taking this. Do you have any come to mind?
That's a great question. So this is interesting in that there's a lot of people get really fired up about being on one side or the other of something. I don't want to get a bunch of hate mail, but I think what's fairly uncontroversial, creatine is good for everyone, especially if you're doing like weightlifting and that kind of exercise. It's really been all positive data. And then a lot sort of depends on what you're looking for in terms of benefit. Curcumin, there's some good evidence about it being a good antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. That's one that I've recommended to a number of people. Those are probably the biggest ones that I can speak to. Protein, of course, the U.S. diet is pretty deficient in protein. So the general advice is 0.8 to a gram of protein per pound. And those would probably be the biggest supplements. Omega-3s, I thought were uncontroversial, but somebody had told me recently that there's some data like, oh, it's just useless, just throwing money down the drain. So I'll leave it up to the audience.
I had a nurse practitioner told me that recently, and that's the first time I had ever heard that fish oil was just like apparently Satan's spawn, and you're just wasting a bunch of money. I take it.
It is definitely buyer beware. And fortunately, there's really good resources out there now to actually look and really sort of interrogate whether something's going to be helpful or not. And there are supplements that can be quite harmful. And so I think we just have to be careful about what we're putting in our body. And some of these other podcasts, whether it's, Andrew Huberman or Peter Attia, they do pretty deep dives into the benefits and risks of some of these supplements. And so I think it's sort of given birth to a whole new generation of kind of biohackers and people who are hyper focused on their health.
Well, there's constantly stuff changing too. Like, what was it, a year or two ago? They tried coming out. I'm saying they isn't the universal yay. They're saying eggs were bad for you, and then they came back a year later saying that no, just kidding, eggs are good for you. There's always people out there trying to make controversial studies, and you have to actually look at what the variables were in the studies and what the results were, and how they're cherry picking the final synopsis, which they're going to put as the headline, which becomes super clickbaity, and people latch on to them, and everything spreads like wildfire because it's, as I said, it's controversial, and people love being able to talk through things that are apparently bad for you that we've thought different the entire time. Dispelling of old wives' tales.
It'd be cool if there's like a scoring system, like a website that you could go to that like was vetted by someone like Erik, someone that was like filtering through the research and like scoring. Okay, fish oil, like
what the FDA should be doing.
Yeah, sure. just like, so like to be able to dispel, but I mean, obviously that's going to be like controversial because then people are going to
Well,
be like, well, this
you'd hope
person's
not.
paid. Yeah.
But yes, it'd be nice if there was some information out there that it was like, matter of factly, this is what the results were. This is why. This is the variable breakdown. This was the population or the population of the study. But people don't want to hear that. They don't want to do the research. They want to have the answers delivered to them. Say eggs are bad. You don't need to worry about why. But someone in a white lab coat with a clipboard said eggs are bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is a website called examine.com that does a pretty good job of exploring a lot of that data and science behind supplements. But yeah, I don't know. I just don't know if they would cover something as simple as eggs, because the argument is, there's cholesterol in the yolk, and um, but yeah, I think more of those educational resources is only good for the community. So.
For sure. And where do you see Wave Neuro going over the next year, 5 years? What studies are you trying to get involved in? What research are you trying to prove, and what um, uh, what treatments are you guys looking to explore into? I know you talked a little bit about the psychedelic space and partnering with different groups. But what do you see going over the next 5 years?
Yeah, we have two FDA trials that are currently ongoing, and the first is a standard protocol for PTSD, and that is occurring. We're at, I think, 5 recruitment sites now, but Texas A&M was a sponsor. U.S. Special Operations Command was the sponsor for stage 1, which was kind of a safety stage, and then we're now into the test stage where we're looking at the efficacy and still collecting safety data. So there's data collection sites at Plano, Texas, um, and Philadelphia and Columbus, Ohio are opening it up. Seattle, and then Costa Mesa will be the other site. And I'll provide a URL link if anybody's interested in enrolling. That's actively recruiting subjects right now. And we're hoping to finish data collection by Q3 this year. Um, so so hold on to your horses. Hopefully, we'll get a really good data point there. And then the second FDA trial is what we call an accelerated program. It's a 2-week protocol, and that's occurring in the state of Ohio. So part of that bill that I talked about is they funded an FDA clinical trial. And I believe that's at Dayton, Ohio. They may open up a second and third data collection site down the road. Right now, they're just similarly in the safety phase, um, but they're actively recruiting as well. So those are 2 trials. I would like for there to be additional trials across many different indications. I could talk for hours, but I don't want to bore your audience. But I think the next one will probably be traumatic brain injury, and specifically the sequelae of persistent post-concussive symptoms. It's called PPCS. Um, Autism is definitely very high on the list. And given the recent we're getting ready to embark on a study on COVID-19 brain fog. A number of our centers have told us, hey, this is really effective for this. And so we'd like to be a bit more thoughtful and diligent about collecting the data. So I think we have an 8-site trial that's getting ready to launch. And then substance use disorder, I think, is a really important one. And we're seeing some really good results out of some of our addiction centers. So so I think it's kind of tip of the iceberg right now, and a lot more exploration and research and trials to be done. But first things first, we'd like to get these PTSD ones completed.
Awesome. And for people that are looking to get the actual Wave Neuro treatment, I know you guys have a location. Your main location was in Newport, California, and then you have Cardiff, basically North County, San Diego, and then San Diego proper. And then you guys also partnered with a couple physician offices throughout the country. Are there other locations outside of those 3 where people can get the specific Wave Neuro treatment?
Yeah, actually, I think we're over 100 locations now, not just in the
Oh,
U.S. but
wow.
also in Australia, Latin America,
What,
Ireland.
what about the
Uh,
Netherlands?
I don't know if we're at the Netherlands. We really should be there though, because they're front runners in TMS. A lot of the devices are manufactured in the Netherlands.
Greg
So,
just moved out there.
That's where I'm out. I'm out living in the Netherlands right now. So that's actually good to know. I didn't know that.
really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, Maastricht University, I believe, is in the Netherlands.
I
They
live like 20 minutes away from Maastricht.
really, they
Yeah.
do brilliant research on TMS. Some that has actually validated our approach, which I appreciate. So yeah, we are growing, but yeah, they would go if they just go to waveneuro.com, they can learn about our company and our approach, and then there's a regulatory reason the treatment center is totally separate from the tech company. And I believe that they list all those sites at a place called braintreatmentcenter.com. And you can see all the different locations. It's called the corporate practice of medicine, where tech has to be separate from the clinical practice. And each of those sites has their own independent doctor. We do sort of make sure the doctors are all board certified, credentialed, and reputable doctors. But yeah, if anyone is interested, the number of places that are using the technology is growing, and they should be able to access them, hopefully someplace locally.
And are these treatments typically covered by insurances or no?
Some yes, some no. So it is they can get access to the treatment through a diagnosis of depression. It's also approved for migraine, headaches, and obsessive compulsive disorder. There's slightly different protocols. And that's why we're seeking on-label indication for PTSD, so that future, God willing, knocking on wood, in the future, if we get the indication, insurance coverage should be able to handle that, so that patients should have access.
Amazing. Is there anything else you want to talk about with the treatment before we sign off?
No, I'm just really appreciative of the time, and it was actually a lot of fun chatting with you guys.
I appreciate it. No, it was
Thanks,
great
Eric.
going
This is
through you guys'
awesome.
treatment. You guys have an amazing setup, service. The technology is quite remarkable. And I know that you guys helped a ton of veterans, first responders, active duty service members, and the people completely outside in different walks of life.
Oh, yeah, it really is our honor to be able to help and give back to anyone who's served. And yeah, I really appreciate everything that you've done, and look forward to some future conversations.
Absolutely. So anyone listening, yeah, Wave Neuro, neuro.com. You can read all about their technology, their treatments, and where you can get services if needed.
And it'll be in the show notes. So
And the show
just go
notes.
down there too.
So thank you so much, Eric. It's really a pleasure speaking with you.
Awesome. Likewise.